Hi everybody, I'm going to be doing my presentation on Canadian Arctic policy amidst Russia's invasion of Ukraine. So in this slide I'm just going to be discussing the agenda and what I plan to cover throughout my presentation. First of all, I'm going to be talking about the summary of the cabinet decision that I will be seeking. Secondly, I'm going to talk a bit about the historical background and the options that I will be pursuing. Thirdly, I'm going to be talking about the considerations that I would like Cabinet to make going forward. And lastly, I'm going to be analyzing some of the risks that are associated with my proposal. And I hope you enjoy the little cartoon that I have off to the side there. So my recommendation is that Canada should increase its military preparedness in the Arctic. And there are a couple of aspects to this recommendation that I want to talk about a bit. The first is that Canada should devise a new military armament strategy for the North to deal with the new challenges that we are facing with Russian aggression. Secondly, I think that we should increase the number of Canadian Rangers currently deployed in the North, which is currently at a number of about 5,000 people. We should also increase our defense spending to the NATO guideline of 2% of our GDP. It's currently at 1.4%. And I also think that we should build 2 new polar class icebreakers. And if you aren't familiar with the icebreakers, these are basically ships that are capable of breaking through sea ice. They can be used for a number of purposes, including national defense, and they'll be able to patrol the Arctic Sea all year round, from what I gather. And lastly, I think that we should also build a naval base at Nanisivik, Nunavut, which has been in the plans for some time, but no government has yet implemented this idea. So this slide will discuss the why factor. Why should Canada be pursuing this particular policy? Well, first of all, Arctic sovereignty is an area of strategic importance for Canada in the 21st century. There has been a growing international interest in the Arctic due to reasons involving resource development, climate change, control of the Northwest Passage, and access to transportation routes. Moreover, recent Russian aggression towards Ukraine could spill over into the Arctic, and while a direct attack on Canadian soil is highly unlikely, it is conceivable that Canadian sovereignty or the sovereignty of Canada's Arctic allies will be challenged by Russia. Russia has also reinvigorated its defense posture in the Arctic. The country claims to have built 475 new military sites, and the country has also reoccupied and modernized several formerly abandoned Cold War bases. Moreover, Canada's military capabilities in the North are in a questionable state, and the federal government really hasn't provided any major upgrade to Canada's defenses since the end of the Cold War. And finally, beyond Russia, China has presented itself as a new threat to Canadian Arctic sovereignty. The country has declared itself a near-Arctic state and has expressed interest in extracting natural resources and using the northern trade route. Historical background. The Arctic became a major security concern for Canada during the Cold War when the Soviet Union acquired nuclear weapons, long-range bombers, and ballistic missiles. It's important to recall that during this period, the Canadian government was responsible for forcibly removing Inuit families from their homes in northern Quebec and resettling them in the high Arctic. This has produced long-standing tensions between the federal government and the Inuit. But when the Cold War ended, almost all activities that the Canadian Department of National Defence conducted in the North were either stopped or substantially reduced. The predominant view was that the Arctic was no longer threatened by Canada's geopolitical adversaries. And finally, the Canadian government did begin to reconsider its neglect of Arctic security in the late 1990s and in the early 2000s. To date, the Canadian government has made progress in rebuilding its capabilities in the North, but operational limitations do remain an ongoing challenge. So in this slide, I'm going to be discussing more recent developments that have transpired in the last few weeks. Firstly, on February 24th, Russia invaded Ukraine. The Canadian government responded with very strict sanctions on top Russian officials and on the Russian economy. About a week later, on March 3rd, the Arctic Council suspended all operations. There were meetings that were being planned in Russia. Those are no longer taking place. And about 2 weeks later, on March 16th, Canada and the US announced that they were planning joint military exercises in the Arctic to stress test their current capabilities. And lastly, I didn't include this in my slide, but a few days ago, on March 28th, the Canadian Liberal government announced that they were purchasing 88 F-35 fighter jets, replacing the aging CF-18 fighter jet, which has been in Canada's arsenal for about 4 decades. So in this slide, I'm going to be outlining the options, with number 1 being the most favorable. So firstly, I think Canada should invest in Canadian military preparedness in the Arctic because Canada's Arctic sovereignty is currently being threatened by acts of Russian aggression in Ukraine. And I've already kind of discussed the benefits of this, namely it would allow Canada to more effectively defend its own sovereignty in the Arctic. A con of this would be that it's costly and it would most likely burden the taxpayer the most. Another option is to revamp NORAD's aging Arctic security infrastructure. So Canada has heavily relied on NORAD to detect air threats since the mid-1950s, but the organization's infrastructure needs to be expanded. So new technology would expand NORAD's early detection capabilities, and that would benefit Canada. But once again, it's costly, and it would most likely burden taxpayers. Another option is to focus on diplomacy and cooperation. Now, diplomacy is cost effective because it doesn't cost anything to negotiate, and it would also boost Canada's peacemaking reputation around the world. But a con of this is that diplomacy will not stop armed conflict once it begins, and diplomacy can only go so far in defending a country's sovereignty. So that's why I like option number 1 the most, because it ensures that Canada is defended at all costs. So before going forward with this policy, it's important to make a number of considerations. Firstly, the premiers of the Northern Territories have expressed concern about Russian aggression, and they are urging the federal government to bolster Canada's northern defense systems. Moreover, the Arctic and Northern Policy Framework centralizes northern peoples in regional security policy. So this means that Indigenous peoples must be at the table when Arctic security priorities are established. Moreover, Canada's military plans for the Arctic remain limited by the difficult logistics of building installations and resupplying forces in the vast and harsh climate of the Arctic. And also, a recent poll by Nanos found that Canadians marginally favor spending more money on deterrence to meet the challenges of such threats as the war in Ukraine. And lastly, this is more of a long-term goal, but Canada needs to start exerting sovereignty in the north if it wishes to establish long-term security. As the glaciers melt, the Arctic will become a zone of increased power competition, and Canada must be ready to meet that competition in the coming decades. So here in my final slide, I would like to go over the risks that could possibly transpire from the implementation of this policy. The first is the potential impact on Inuit food security. So as you may know, there's a crisis going on right now in the north where about 2/3 of people are food insecure. The risk of this is that increased militarization could divert funding and awareness away from addressing food security in northern communities. There's also the problem of military pollution. The military creates tons of toxic waste every year, and expanding Canada's military presence in the Arctic could certainly further damage an already fragile environment. And then there's the problem of cost and taxation. The cost of increasing Canada's military preparedness in the Arctic is in the billions, and the financial burden will mostly be incurred by taxpayers. And lastly, there is the potential for military escalation. Increased militarization might be perceived as escalation by Moscow, which would only reinforce the cycle of military buildup on both sides.